This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Malick Hour, a celebration of the life and work of American filmmaker Terrence Malick. I'm very pleased to have with me today Ian Nathan, who is a writer, a prolific writer on film, and now a documentary filmmaker. And he's going to be talking about Days of Heaven. Thanks for joining me, Ian.
Always a pleasure, John.
We were talking just before we started recording that you've done an Aliens documentary. You're working on the Thing expanded documentary, and you've got a Spielberg book coming out soon.
Yes, life is very busy. I'm also starting a book in the same series as Spielberg on Scorsese. So, a lot of different things going on at once. But what's been really interesting, actually, just in the context of Days of Heaven and Terrence Malick, was when you start reading up about Scorsese, you realize how interconnected that new Hollywood world really is. I kind of knew they were all friends and it was all the world they were taking part in, but they really were around the same dinner tables. They really were the guys just sort of staying up late into the night discussing these things. And they really fed off each other. And the idea of a movement, although I don't think it was sort of consciously designed from within, is very strong. You look into Scorsese and now looking into Malick a bit more, reading your book, I'm like, these guys were contemporaries. They were friends, and they really did talk to each other. It's very strong.
Badlands and Mean Streets, debuted at the same New York Film Festival and was reviewed by Pauline Kael alongside Spielberg's Sugarland Express with Goldie Hawn. I always blank on the name of that film. I don't know why.
Because you're a Badlands man. It was like
dissing it, unconsciously dissing it. Yeah, and I think there's also an element that there's connective tissue there with the prior generation, because Malick's very much coming from Arthur Penn, and he knew Arthur Penn, he knew Irving Kershner, and all these people who were just slightly before the sort of the TV brats. And
it really is the case that, they've almost all remade Bonnie and Clyde to a certain extent, haven't they? Malick did it with, I'm not saying directly, but Badlands, Sugarland Express, Boxcar Bertha, everyone did their kind of, the Rain People with Coppola, if you want. Everyone did their road movie. And you can say, well, Arthur Penn really fathered all of that. Absolutely.
And there's that sense as well of Europeans. That's how they managed to get European cinema into their own films, those influences, because of course Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard were both supposed to be at certain points filming Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, it's a fusion, isn't it? You go back to that era and you look at these films, of which Malick is at the heart of, even though he's not mentioned as often. But there really is, the cliche is true. They were new Hollywood, they did revolutionize, but they were playing with genre. They were playing with the tradition, and a tradition they loved. I think it's often sort of looked at like they were just angry young men who just wanted to rip it all up and dismiss it all. But actually, they all adored Hollywood. They all adored what Hollywood stood for. They just wanted to do it in a way that the Europeans did. They wanted to approach it in this fresh and exciting way. And they were so young as well. I mean, it's terrifying now as a 50-something man to think how much they achieved in their 20s. And what an astonishing time it was. Especially, again, it's a bit of a cliche, but when you compare it to what Hollywood is like now, when you compare it to the kind of production line we face, even by a lot of those filmmakers who have remained, the bite is gone, the excitement is gone. And there are good films, but the 70s thing is a real thing.
Yeah, I think if you look at Scorsese in particular, Spielberg to some extent as well, they do have to sort of attach themselves to an up-and-coming star. You get the feel that DiCaprio and Scorsese had sort of figured out that this way DiCaprio gets to make sort of hefty projects, and this way Scorsese gets to use budgets that he wouldn't necessarily otherwise have access to.
Yeah, the other day I was thinking about the Survivors. I was actually thinking about, was there a book in the Survivors of, it's like a long sequel to Easy Riders, who is still there. And it's kind of really about Spielberg and Scorsese, because they are the two big survivors. De Palma's drifted away. Obviously, Milius went a long time ago. Coppola, I suppose we've had him come back this year, but he's not the same man that he was. But Malick, again, he's kind of the ghost at the banquet. He is now more productive than a lot of them. He's been present by not being present almost. He's had that wonderful ability of being a constant, apart from obviously a 20-year gap, and still being around. But let me ask a question to you about Malick and about Days of Heaven in particular, because I always think of Malick in terms of landscape. The first thing that comes to mind is he is a director of landscape. I mean, we talk about Scorsese. Scorsese is a director of streets, and he's a director of New York, whereas Malick is the man who wants to show you America in a very sort of rural sense. Is that even more so than Badlands, where he came from with Days of Heaven? Is this his primal landscape film?
Yeah, I think definitely so. I think there's an oddity in this, because there's a certain sense which Malick is always seen as this very thoroughly authentic filmmaker, that he's filming stuff is partly to do with his obvious sort of spirituality, and yet, like every filmmaker that we know and we talked about, he has to deal on a day-to-day basis with the basic practicalities. So Badlands is set in I think it's in the what do they say? It's not in Texas, put it that way, and that's where Malick formed his idea of what America was Texas, and specifically Austin, where he went to school, to this boarding school, St. Stephen's. And it was in the middle of nowhere. There was a sort of a river ran through it, if you like. There was a river down below, and just fields stretched out. I've been to this school, and it's beautiful. It's a really gorgeous place. Now it's connected by the main road, and 20 minutes you're in downtown Austin. It's not, it doesn't have that. But it just didn't have that then. I don't think the river had been. There was bridges missing that are now there, and so he said that Days of Heaven was conceived here. This was where he had this idea, and he also during the summer he'd work the summers on the harvest, and he would drive combine harvesters, and he would do basic manual labor, and he loved listening to the voices of the people that he would meet, and he would meet basically people who couldn't get a job elsewhere, who were petty criminals or were very much on the edge or the margins of society. He would listen to their. I think he was a little bit in love with a sort of beat idea of Kerouac and going and living off the land and all the and getting this taste for life, and it didn't. And so I think it informed not only this film, but there's a certain sort of shit-kicking sort of dialogue that he does that goes through Badlands. It goes through his short that he made, Lantern Mills, before this. It goes through his scripts for his other films that were made, like Pocket Money. It's just this sort of low-level, uneducated, rural people just talking who live in the middle of nowhere. Now, the reason I said that you have this idea of authenticity when it comes to landscape and whatnot is because all of these films were then filmed in very different places to where they were supposedly set. So, Days of Heaven looks beautiful and hot and Texas, and it's shot in Alberta, Canada, which is it
was freezing cold as well, wasn't it?
Freezing cold, and they've got they're wearing scuba diving costumes underneath their trousers when they're walking in the river and things like that, because otherwise they'd freeze their toes off. That magic hour that became the name of the book and everything is also part of that. They insist was just the nature of the light in the northern hemisphere, that they could lengthen out that dusk-like effect, from to hours of time rather than 20 minutes. But I mean, that's a controversial subject, and many different points of view have been expressed about that.
I'm sure it was a matter of each day was unto itself, really. If you've been on a movie set, you know that it's not a completely controllable environment. Why? Yeah, I mean, watched the film again only yesterday. What struck me are two things. One is how brisk it is. You know, I think I remember it. It's a kind of very slow burn, sort of very, in a modern sense, Malick style film of sort of poetic, ruminating, meditative. But actually, it's not. Well, it's got all those things in it, but it rattles along, you know, because he kind of almost evades the idea of assembling the drama in a traditional way. He doesn't build scenes in a normal way. He just lets them sort of intimate in front of an audience. But at the same time, I was also aware of this kind of idea that I don't know whether Malick professes this, but I think he certainly expresses this of film is the way America mythologizes itself. And film is the medium in which this brief history and this very dramatic history of immigrants coming in and taking over and walking across and making sense of this incredibly vast landscape, you know, becomes the American story. And it's through, you know, okay, you can argue Steinbeck and some of the Faulkner and the early authors, but I think it's film with the Western genre, of which Days of Heaven's kind of the fringes of, is a mythologizing medium. And that is the purpose of what Malick is doing. Somewhere there's a question in there which sort of suggests, do you see the film as myth making?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely see he's got this. It's a really strange thing that he does, in that he has this beauty and has this, and even the word sort of Malickian, not even this idea that there is such an aesthetic that he professes and all the rest of it. There are certain things connected to that which either spoken, you know, especially in negative reviews of his work, you know, that this is superficial. This is, when his film was released, the overwhelming majority of reviews prioritized how beautiful it was, and of those, even the positive ones seemed to be concerned that it was too beautiful. But I think that what I'd like to argue is that he is deeply rooted in reality, and so there is this mythic, the beauty and this poetry and this music that carries you along. And yet at the same time, within the first 3 minutes of this film, a man has been killed, kind of brutally, you know, and inadvertently. And that will happen again and again and again in the film, that there will be moments of very sharp violence which will just burst out, as they did in Badlands as well, where there is this romanticism and this sort of everybody just getting along and trying to do their best in a wicked world, and this fairy tale element. But I'll give you another example, actually. Linda Manz's voiceover, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about in more detail. When you actually listen to what she's talking about, the very first time she has an extended monologue, she's talking about a description of hell. You know, people will be running around and on fire, and birds will all have their wings on fire. And you're sort of lulled by the way she's saying it, how poetic it is and how beautiful it is, that you know, you almost don't notice that what she's talking about is not heaven. She's talking about hell. And the background of this film, which he did originally sell to the studio as, I'm going to make my Western. And then he told his editor, Billy Weber, I've got money for the farming movie. So he's sort of already knows that he's playing the game, which incidentally, he sold the New World as as Romeo and Juliet meets Gladiator. And I always thought that was, you know, there's something in Malick, is this sort of like, oh, I don't know anything about anything, and he knows exactly what he's doing. You know, he's pressing those money buttons when he can. And so there's this reality behind the myth. There is a Western here, and that myth making that goes with the landscape. But there's also poverty, there's also cold, there's also hunger, and there's also the tragedy that creates.
Do you think, it's one of the great, it's almost the great American subject, isn't it? You know, we think of There Will Be Blood, and you think of Gangs of New York, and these films are about the birth pangs of America. And because it's such a nation, the subject of the frontier and then the Depression, it's about survival, isn't it? Actually, the formation of America is, who can survive in this place. And actually, the gear character personifies that. He is basically his instinct, as cruel as it is survival. He sees an opportunity in the Sam Shepard character. He sees a chance to kind of live a bit longer because they're not thinking this is going to be, 50 years in the future. They're thinking, if I can get to next summer, it's a good thing. And of course, that is the story of America. And that is really, if we can take it a stage further, still going on. That kind of attitude and that sort of sensibility is still built into the DNA of the country.
Absolutely. I mean, he's just trying to get ahead. And, it was, and the whole idea when you see those photographs right at the beginning of sort of not Walker Percy, that the photographer I mean, those brilliant photographs of the Depression. Walker Evans, those beautiful photographs that you have that are like Walker Evans photographs at the very beginning. And there's even pictures of like somebody jumping from one precipice to another. And Linda Manns is sort of effortlessly joins those photographs as if she also is a documentary moment from this period in history. And then you get this. I always feel it's a very David Lynch moment because the use of the sound is so industrial and loud. It sounds like something Lynch would use in Elephant Man or Eraserhead. And of course, Lynch and Malick knew each other from the AFI, and because they have a mutual best friend in Jack Fisk. They and you just have this sort of level of sort of industrial brutality that you get. And yet it's also beautifully, they're in a bed making like flowers to sell. And when you talked about cinema earlier and myth making, the one use of cinema literally in the film is they show Charlie Chaplin's The Immigrant. And so you have that idea that this is pre-Depression. The Depression hasn't happened yet. The Depression's going to happen in about 10, 15 years. But even before the Depression, there is very, very poor people. And those very, very poor people can become very, very rich people very quickly. In the original script of the Days of Heaven, there was a scene in which the Sam Shepard character dreams of his father being diagnosed with some illness and sort of walking out to the river with rocks in his pockets to kill himself as a way of sort of, so I won't weigh down on the family. Yeah. So even the so-called exploiters of the poor, as Sam Shepard's character in a lesser film would be, even he's only one generation away from destitution and poverty. He's the violence of acquiring what he has acquired.
Because it's, they're not, I mean, where we were 1916, isn't it? So we're not, the idea of the frontier in the West, and we're still kind of a little bit there. There's the Panhandle where the film is set, obviously, and civilization has got as far. We have the automobile and the train and the planes of the circus that signal civilization is making it. Yet at the same time, you can feel we're at the edge of something still. It's not an entirely tamed country.
Oh, absolutely. And you're utterly dependent on nature. Nature is going to live with, is going to do things to you. You're trying to industrialize, the production of massive amounts of food. To then send back, presumably, to Chicago and New York and the cities. Locusts can arrive, bad weather, an early frost can arrive, and you're done for.
How much do you think Malick was, wanting to reach for the biblical? That he wanted it to have this kind of, the way the biblical parables and those stories are told. This follows, as much as it's a literary film, it's a biblical film, isn't it?
I think it's a really funny question, that, because I think nowadays you'd be easily, he's just made A Hidden Life. His next film is going to be about the life of Jesus, or it's about episodes from the life of Jesus. So he's definitely, I think, in his latter years, swinging straight towards overt religiosity, although I still feel it's a religiosity which is much more ecumenical than a lot of people give him credit for. I think he's as interested in science and Buddhism as he is in Christianity to some degree. So when he did Days of Heaven, I'm not sure how religious he was. I'm not sure if he was still. I mean, he definitely had a religious upbringing. His family has always been very religious. If he was at home, he would be going to church. So the influence of the Bible on this I think he would have a knowledge. The title comes from the Bible. Days of Heaven is a direct sort of citation. So there's no doubt that he's thinking in those terms of big things, and it sort of elevates the. There's also a story in I think it's Abraham who frequently pretends, Abraham and his wife frequently pretend to be brother and sister whenever they go into a strange land. So that idea of pretending to be brother and sister has sort of biblical precedent. I think it was the interesting thing was they went into a land and the king was called Abimelech, and Abimelech is his paternal grandfather. It's the same name. And also the same name as the dog that you see at the very beginning of Badlands. So, again, everything is connected.
Of course.
But I think I think the Bible gives him a sort of, that's the simplicity of the story. There's a certain sort of deep-rooted. You know everything about the characters, but you know nothing about the characters. Bill could be he's just poor guy, and Abby is poor girl, and the farmer hasn't got a name. He doesn't. He isn't even named and it feels like they could almost be just these types, these forces, just like nature, just as elemental, just like fire and sky and river.
Do you think, we'll come back to the idea of genre as quickly, because I was also struck by the fact the film cost $4 million, I think you say in the book, and it is an epic. If I was going to pick a genre, and obviously the Western comes into it, I would call it American epic. Yet, it was made actually very efficiently, and the kind of sister film is the one at the end of the era, which is Heaven's Gate, which was profligate and slightly out of control, but in a way sort of carrying on the same themes. Yet, there is this sort of epic tradition that actually thrives in New Hollywood, even though it was seen as old-fashioned.
I think with Malick, the epicness is about perspective. Whereas with Heaven's Gate, you feel there are certain set pieces where it absolutely stands out, and there are set pieces in Days of Heaven as well. But there's. The epic is like a field. It's looking at how light changes the view of a landscape, and it's easy to say that sort of thing. It's really difficult to do. I think of Thin Red Line and how landscape is filmed in the Thin Red Line.
Yeah.
And there is a moment in the Thin Red Line where a hill turns a different color because the cloud has just left the sun, and the sun has just brightened up this field. And you'd have to not be alive to watch that and not feel your heart do something. Yeah. Even though, and this is where what I was saying about that distance between poetry and reality, or myth and reality are, even though that the light, the sunshine shining on that hill means that men are going to die, because now they're going to be much more visible as they attack the pillbox at the top of the hill. And that's the thing that I get with Malick. On the one hand, there is this, God, what a beautiful hill. And on the other hand, there's this, but there's this really practical reason that's a bad thing. And those two entirely seemingly different ideas can exist in that mind at exactly the same time. So the same thing's true of Days of Heaven. On the one hand, it's a sort of tawdry little gossipy love affair gone wrong. And on the other hand, it's the absolute original sin in the birth of America.
No one can sort of marry the sumptuous and the desolate together in the same frame, like Terrence Malick. You have, contrasting, if not inconceivable ideas coming together. And that's, I suppose, genius, these two completely different things, yet in every frame. But let's talk a little bit of history now. He's made Badlands, and we're in early 70s Hollywood. Is Terrence Malick part of the movie brats? Is he a movie brat?
It's really difficult because I think he's a little bit older. And I think he's lived a bit more of a life. I mean, Spielberg's gone straight into the studio, basically walked in and got himself a job doing television and worked his way up from there. You know, Friedkin's doing a similar thing in New York. I think Malick he's gone and he's tried to have several lives before he decided on a film. He's tried to do the academic, brilliant student, brilliant. I mean, I talked to one guy who was a really interesting, a guy who worked with Malick, and he said, you have to understand that Terry's IQ is genius level IQ. And it's like somebody who is like 2 meters tall. It's like somebody who is like 7 feet, like basketball tall. It's really difficult for him to sort of keep bending over so you can understand what he's thinking and what he's dealing with. And so I think that he could do philosophy, but he sort of just found himself unable to deal with some of the old fuddy-duddies that he would have had to deal with. And I think in the end, he just thought it wasn't fun. Then he went and did journalism, and he had a great time doing that, but he couldn't do deadlines. As you can imagine, deadlines are not exactly conducive to his way of thinking. Then he found, I think he had a really good friend who introduced him to George Stevens Jr. and the idea of the AFI, who works on Jacob Brackman, who works on Days of Heaven. He worked on Badlands as well to some degree. He's a bit of a writer. He wrote, what's that, King of Marvin Gardens and... He was also Carly Simon's lyricist, so he sort of has a foot in both worlds of both music industry and so when Malick goes to Hollywood, he's this thing of like being very new to the world, not knowing anything about it, but also he has all these connections already. You know, he's married to Jill Jakes, or he marries her very soon after. Jill Jakes worked with Arthur Penn. Arthur Penn actually pays, they use Arthur Penn's apartment for their marital reception. So they're very close with the Penns, and they go and see him filming Little Big Man. And so he has all these introductions. When he's with the AFI, that very first year of the conservatory, George Stevens Jr. just loves him. And this is something which goes all the way through Malick's life. He wins really powerful people over to him almost immediately. You know, the reason he got a job at the New Yorker was because the guy who edited the New Yorker just fell in love with him. Just went, oh, this guy's amazing. Wallace Shawn, isn't it? Wallace Shawn at the time? It's Wallace Shawn's dad. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Wallace Shawn's the actor from The Princess Bride who says, inconceivable, I don't even think you know what that means. Or he keeps using inconceivable as, yeah. And by the way, it was Wallace Shawn on this, on Days of Heaven, who made a very good suggestion on the script, which was don't have the farmer be an old man, have him be... Because the idea was that he was going to be an old man, and that makes the idea of the plot against him more sort of, you know, there's no sexual attraction, I'm just marrying him for his money, and then sooner or later this guy's just going to die. But the idea of making him a young man who's got some sort of tuberculosis and has one foot on a banana peel, the other on a roller skate, as a character says in the so to answer your question, when he goes to Hollywood, he's kind of overleapt the whole movie brats moment, because he's already writing films, he's already got scripts going, he's already friends with just loads of people. And I mean, to the extent that a friend of his from school comes up to California and Terry sort of shows him around. And Terry says, and this guy says, I need some money. He says, oh, why don't you write a script? And basically, within like a number of like 4 weeks and 5 parties, he's introduced him to enough people that this guy ends up writing a script and making a film and making some money. And he's just effortlessly done that. It's not, he's not even. So there's an ease to Malick's maneuvering at this point, which is which is kind of staggering given his reputation as this sort of recluse who doesn't want to, which is just totally wrong.
Yeah. What's the converse of that? I mean, obviously he's very personable and he's made a relatively hit film with Badlands. What is the studio's attitude toward him at this point in time? And where are they at? Are they now kind of, we've got to bring in the unusual stuff, we've got to bring in the radicals, we've got to rethink this whole model? I mean, Charlie Bloodhorn loves him, doesn't he? He's the head of Paramount. I mean, he was a very excitable character at the best of times anyway, Polish immigrant, and
Charlie Bloodhorn doesn't love him until after Days of Heaven.
Right. Okay.
It's when he sees Days of Heaven, he gives him a blank check. He literally says, "You can make whatever you want to make," which is possibly why he doesn't make anything for 20 years. There's a really good. Don't tell anybody they can do anything, because anything and nothing look very similar. I think what happened was that Paramount want new material and they want prestige stuff. They don't want. They've got stuff that's making money, but they haven't got anything prestigious. They see in Bert Schneider a way in to this kind of material. So Bert and his brother want to work with Malick.
Bert had produced Easy Rider, hadn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He's produced Easy Rider.
He's another one of the godfathers of the generation.
Easy Rider's Raging Bulls is essentially his story of his sort of going up and then coming down again. Yeah, I mean, he's a very charismatic man. He goes really hard into radical left politics and the Black Power movement, and he's involved with lots of crazy stuff. And in fact, he wins an Oscar for the documentary, the anti-Vietnam documentary. I think it's called Hearts and Minds, and he gets up on the stage in this white tuxedo and reads a letter from the North Vietnamese Peace Committee. and you can imagine John Wayne and Frank Sinatra in the back are going apeshit, and then they read out something to disavow the ceremony. And at that point, Shirley MacLaine goes out and says something else, and it's just like I mean, it's the Will Smith slap of the time,
Yeah.
So Bert Schneider, Malick, along with Francis Ford Coppola and can't remember who it was, but one of Bert Schneider's girlfriends at this point is a very successful actress as well, and she's along for the ride. They'll go out to Cuba, and they go to Fidel Castro's speeches, and they go and potentially, I think there's a Black Panther who is sort of a fugitive in Cuba, which Bert Schneider arranged for him to flee after he murdered one of his assistants. Not a very nice episode in the Black Panther history. And basically, it's one of those conversations of, I want you to what's your next project? I'll help you make it. Now, Bert Schneider put his own house on the as part of the contract. He made himself personally liable for the film. It's a relatively low budget, as you said. I don't think anybody would say that any of Malick's films were easy shoots. He always seemed to go a bit beyond, over time, certainly, over budget to a degree, but that often happened in post. Badlands he'd had a very bad experience with because he dipped into withholding taxes, which means that he had the IRS coming after him. Right. Because you're not supposed to do that. That's the money you keep back so you can pay the tax man. But once he gets onto doing a film, he just becomes, that's him. He wants to do the film. And so when he got the opportunity to make this film, even though it wasn't the right time of year, the grass wasn't growing where he wanted it to grow, he just, he got Jack Fisk and said, okay, what are the solutions? And in Jack Fisk, he found, who is his production designer on all of his films until the very last one, he found a compadre who absolutely facilitated everything he wanted to do. So, Jack Fisk sent me a drawing that he made of the house that you see and the whole idea of that house was that it was slightly based on an Edward Hopper house painting as well, but it's like the house you'd see in New England on the coast that's looking out
it's like a fairy tale, isn't it? It's sort of stuck in the middle of this field, as you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
And it doesn't look a farmhouse. It doesn't. It's Victorian and
absolutely, and it even has this like widow's walk sort of terrace where you're supposed to. It's for a sailor's wife to look out to see if the husband's ship is returning, and of course it's surrounded by this sea of grass and land.
How much? This is probably a bit of an open-ended question because it's probably your entire book asks, but how much do you see as Days of Heaven as representing the Malick style, and what is that style?
I would argue that I think it's very incredibly representative, and it's much more, in some ways, it's much more representative of his methodology than Badlands is, because Badlands, he writes a script because he thinks, I need the script to get money, and he's surprised that nobody reads the script. Everybody just is interested in where did you get the rest of the money from. And it's sort of like, if so-and-so trusts you, then I'll trust you. So with this one, I think he realized the script isn't as important, but he writes a fairly solid script, which is pretty much what you see, but it's much more wordy, the script. And when he starts making the film, almost immediately he starts getting rid of lines, and he's not particularly happy with the actors that he has. That's one of the first things. So he doesn't get John Travolta, which is the actor he really wanted, and he gets Richard Gere, who at this point is a complete unknown. He appears in another film that's actually shot after this film because it takes so long for this film to make its way to the cinemas. I don't think he's particularly pleased with Brooke Adams, or at least she didn't feel that he was pleased with her. The only one he's really 100%... Sam Shepard has never acted before, is a playwright, and Billy Weber said that they had to basically create his performance out of, in the editing room because he wasn't good enough. And Linda Manns was the only one that he loved as a performer. He thought she has everything. So what he would do is he would take all the lines out, and he would tell them to do scenes with no lines and just think their lines. And he would, and I think this created a methodology for him, that he was just shooting stuff that was very impressionistic. And he did this for the whole shoot, and then he would do pickup shoots. And while he was doing this, he had a second unit down, I think it was in Missouri or Wisconsin, or it was in another part of the country, totally another part. And they had a shot list, and they went out and they basically shot lots of nature thing, with water rippling over a pond and a bird taking flight, or a murmuration of starlings or whatever. And they would go and much of that is in the film. Lots of that is in the film. And this methodology of having a second unit going and doing nature stuff while he does one stuff, throwing the script out quite early on, concentrating on light rather than scenes, concentrating on moments rather than characters necessarily. And then in the post-production and the editing process, and in particular in the recording of the voiceover, then you have the place where the film is made, especially with the choosing of Now, I'm saying this as if this methodology is something he's very confidently decided on. It isn't. This is a series of disasters. Yeah. This is him not having confidence in what he's doing. He's going through a divorce. He's feeling increasingly isolated. He doesn't think the crew respect him. He doesn't think he has a cinematographer who's really absolutely on the same page as him, Nestor Almandaros, who is a Spanish cinematographer who's worked with Truffaut and Roma, and is this really amazing cinematographer. But he times out. He has to go off and film. He has a deal with Truffaut. He has to go and Haskell Wexler comes in, who is very much Bert Schneider's guy, and he comes in to sort of crack the whip and get things moving again. And when he gets into the the editing suite and he looks at his assembly cut, which is his long cut of everything put together, he thinks, I've cut out so many lines, no one's going to be able to understand this. The story isn't there. And then they have a really trouble working out how to, so they go through various solutions of, maybe it can be diary entries, maybe it can be letters between two people, the two girls, Linda Manz and her friend. And it's only on the last night of Linda Manz being in Los Angeles, because she's supposed to be flying back the next day, that has a recording session with Terry in a sort of like a flat top tape deck, and it's not even in the studio, and she starts telling him this story of revelations, which the woman she was staying with the night before told her, because she was a minor at the time and she had to have a chaperone.
It's kind of rather Christian woman she ended up staying with in LA, wasn't it?
Exactly, and she was saying,
the Bible every night, and
exactly, and she said, they said this thing, and they're all going to go down to the thing, and if you listen to it that's the actual cassette recording. That it's not like they did re-record it, because you can tell the audio is a different quality to the other audio.
But it works, doesn't it? Because it's like it's her thoughts. It's removed from the environment. It's her recollections almost from some future place. She's looking back, and so it's got that interior quality to it. By chance, maybe, but it's. And I just want to hone in a little bit here, because voiceover is a fascinating thing. And I'm looking into Scorsese at the moment. There's a lot of voiceover, but yet voiceover is a cheat in filmic terms. Voiceover is anti-film. You're meant to show, don't tell. Whereas by definition, voiceover tells, and it's often seen as a quick fix to problem narratives, all those things. It's got a very bad reputation. Yet two of the greatest filmmakers of the medium, Scorsese and Malick, have turned it into an art form. So, how do we interpret this?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Goodfellas and Casino and, Taxi Driver. Absolutely. I think that's, Apocalypse Now has some of the best, voiceover ever. I totally agree. And I think there's a thing that when voiceover is used for exposition, then it is, there is a sense of the original Blade Runner, when he's sort of trying to say how I got from A to B. Androids don't have photographs either. What was he doing with photographs? I better have a look at the photographs.
I knew the lingo every good cop.
Exactly. Sushi, my wife used to call me cold fish, which is funny because it shows that in the 1980s people had to be, sushi had to be explained to the audience because it wasn't necessarily taken. But the thing about Badlands, which is scripted with voiceover, Days of Heaven isn't scripted with voiceover, and when the voiceover comes in, it is supposed to be saving the film, but he uses the voiceover not as exposition, but there is very bare bits of exposition in there, she loved the farmer, which Linda says at one point. It is a crucial moment because it's not necessarily obvious that what's happening. So that marks a moment where the whole film shifts. Those moments were apparently done by basically showing Linda Manz the film and the scene and saying what happens in this part of the film. And she just explained it in her own words, and that's what you get as a voiceover. She loves the farmer. There wasn't there's no bad in him. There's one line that they did write for her, which I love, which is, there was no bad in him. You give him a flower, he'd keep it forever. And she's supposed to be from Chicago, but she has this broad New York voice. It's
she's extraordinary, Linda Manz, isn't she? I think Malick says it, and you quote in the book that she was the heart of the film. In the edit, he just said, concentrate on her. She is the storyteller. She is the kind of presence. I'm not quite sure of America, of something greater than the rest of the characters, because they're kind of elusive. These three young, beautiful people. And, it's hilarious to kind of hear Malick's view that neither Sam Shepard, Richard Gere, nor Brooke Adams were any good at what they could do, yet they're three wonderful actors. Yet it's the naturalistic young girl who he adores and who carries the film.
I think that's the key. I think that he sees accident as the best thing he can do. He sees accident, he sees the unrehearsed. I think and this is why I was going back to process and methodology. You know, one of the books about Malick is called Rehearsing the Unexpected, and I think that really goes. Carlo Hinterman and his collaborators, they wrote that book, which is a really beautiful sort of oral history of the making of various of the films. I think that's a really good title because I think that's his method. And so somebody like Linda, and you know, he'll get it with other, you know, I think that's what happens with Thin Red Line is his camera goes to actually the actors who aren't that good actors, and he prefers them to the actors who, like Adrian Brody, who's maybe a bit more polished, who's maybe more driven to be the best actor. And he's like, well, no, Jim Caviezel, who is, you know, has already been in films, but he was in Wyatt Earp before Thin Red Line in '96. But he's not a great actor. He just looks good, and he's a bit strange. He's got a strangeness to him, and he was open to Malick saying to him, you know, now think about your mother, or do this or do that, and he could pull out of him a performance that I don't think anybody has since. I mean, I think he's okay in The Passion, you know, underneath the prosthetics, but he hasn't exactly, you know, set the world on fire with his career since The Thin Red Line.
No. But what is it, you know, about the Linda Mann's character, who's called Linda eventually in the film? She wasn't originally that in the script. I just want to, you know, because
she couldn't remember her lines, because she
couldn't remember her lines.
Couldn't remember who she was.
But what is it about her presence, do you think, that, and a little bit similar to Sissy Spacek in Badlands, and I'm trying to get the words right here because she's strange. Both are slightly strange. Both are slightly removed from the brutality of the world they're in. And, you know, it's a lesser brutality in Days of Heaven, but it's a tragedy unfolding before yet the young girl. And she's sort of wise beyond her years, yet sort of very childish at the same time, rather sort of angelic. You know, what is it that Malick likes about that trope, that idea of the floating female voice? And it becomes, and Jim Caviezel in Thin Red Line carries on the idea with the idea in a male format, but yeah, slightly removed characters from the drama.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I think there's a kind of transcendent innocence. I think it's an innocence which isn't an absence of the apprehension of wickedness. I mean, after all, she has to have lived a life already, even at her young age. She's seen things. She's suffered hunger, and she's been on the street. She's a street girl, you know, a bit like Linda Mann's herself was. You know, she was a bit of a punkish. You know, she turned up on the set, and the first things she said to Brooke Adams were, "Have you got any grass?" You know, it wasn't exactly, you know, the children are coming. We better be careful around her. It's like she was, you know, she was a very funny but a right royal pain in the arse, according to Brooke Adams, you know. And they said, and so I think there's this sort of lived-in innocence that even though she's had this experience and everything, she's still managed to retain a genuine goodness. And she is also, I think, from the point of view of the film, she's also the future. She's the person who is going to live into, you know, I mean, when you get to the end of the film, obviously the two male characters are dead. Abby is off to a life that you don't even really understand. I kind of think Abby has a similar sort of trajectory to Sissy Spacek in Badlands, where she seems to be forgiven for her crimes with a lot of hard looks, maybe. But by the looks of her, she's inherited her husband's money. You know, she's well dressed. She's got money to travel, and I get a feeling she's been paid off by the family, or she's, you know, or is there a family even? So it's Linda Manns who is really the only survivor continuing that you know, that journey. She's the one who's going to become America now.
Can I talk about inspiration? behind the film, behind Malick? You know, how does he use inspiration? I mean, while he's very much a filmmaker unto himself with an emergent style that very few directors can match, I still got a sense of East of Eden. I got a sense of Giant. I got a sense of John Ford. You know, the grand tradition that these young filmmakers still adored. Plus, obviously, literary stuff. You know, Steinbeck, Thomas Hardy is mentioned. You know, you say Brooke Adams very much saw it as a Thomas Hardy story. Faulkner, that sort of literary generation, and of course, as we've already talked about, the Bible. So, you know, what are the key influences on Days of Heaven in particular?
Yeah, I mean, he's also looking at like paintings of Bruegel and sort of like peasant, rural sort of things. And I think there's a real Russian thing going on. He's always interested in, um, of course, his own background is to the east. So I think he's also interested in that Dostoevsky sort of, and Chekhov, the idea of the steppes. You know, this is the American version of that kind of serf-like existence with the Lord of the Manor. You know, it could be a character from Tolstoy, even it could be a prince who's sort of surveying, wants to be a part of the people, but is always going to be, separate from them. So he's definitely pulling in all these influences, and I think he's probably film is crowded with the other influences, whereas I think somebody with Martin Scorsese, the film is the primary influence, and music is second, and then literature is probably quite far behind those first two. Spielberg and Lucas and Brian De Palma and people like that, I think film and TV are right up there. Maybe Friedkin would add opera and theatre to the list, but I feel with Malick is the reader of the bunch. He's the poet. He's the guy who's reading his poetry. He's reading his books. I think Hardy is definitely in there. And when you read his scripts are written by someone who is kind of bursting to write a novel as well. You feel, that he's the level of complexity when it comes not to the way that plots work or anything like that, but the characters' emotions. I mean, I would go back to how this avoids simplicity on so many levels. This is a tragedy, and this isn't my own thought. I was told this by someone else, but this is a tragedy in which everybody is right, and I think that's such a hard thing to do, because it's so easy to just say, okay, who's the antagonist in this? Who's the bad person here? Or who does the thing which is really bad? Where do they give themselves away? What's the moment? What's the tell? And that doesn't happen here. There's no point where you're, even right down to the fight scene, who is going towards who? Who is threatening who? I mean, it's there's a moment where you could say, well, it was an empty gesture. He's not really going to fire that gun. And how does he know? And how would he have? And everything is, it's just so complex. And, where's the murder in the heart? When again, it reminds me of a Russian thing. When they go out hunting for like pheasants at one point, and he fires his gun into the ground, there's that like, again, it feels like Dostoevsky to me. Someone considering a crime but then not doing it. Does that equal being good, or just not being bad? It's like you don't get any plus, you don't get any gold stars for not murdering somebody. But it just feels, it just feels.
There's sort of a hint, isn't there, of male bonding going on. It's not as, but obviously it's a love story, it's a love triangle, and it's clearly the passages of one woman falling out of love with one man and falling into love with another man. But there is in the background, often just done with gestures and framing, and a sense that Bill is also bonding to the farmer. He is also coming to like him and love him in a way that a weird family unit has developed, right up to the circus, the arrival of the circus, the kind of surreal moment.
And talk about pacing, when that circus just arrives just in the moment when everything was about to explode. It's amazing.
Yeah, but it's fascinating. Bill is the the intriguing character in a sense, certainly on repeat visits. And I was kind of bowled over by the fact that not only was John Travolta the number one choice, Stallone was number two. And the kind of idea of recasting it with Travolta, obviously he was the main man at that time in terms of the directors, but Stallone, who knows what Stallone would have made it. But I actually think Gere is really good in it, and because it's about contained emotion. So much of it's about the landscape, and then the detail expresses the emotion, but the actors can't. And you can see him almost bursting to want to, can I just have a scene, Terry? It's one scene where I get to do it. Yeah, I really feel it. And the more you watch it, the more the idea of, he's a child as well. In fact, they're all children, apart
Absolutely.
from the Robert Wilkie character, they're all children and lost in this kind of Eden.
Absolutely. And I mean, they have that. You're right. They have their moments where they're sitting outside and they're saying, where have you been? Where did you go? What did you do? And he's learning from him because, the farmer's a very lonely character. He hasn't really had anything. And, even when Bill goes and he learns about the farmer's illness, when he learns the doctor says, you haven't got long to live, and he overhears it. He's at that. The reason he's there at the doctor's car is he's stealing medicine for Abby.
Yeah.
Because she's got, and so every bad thing comes from a good thing, and every good thing leads to a bad thing. I love the scene when, and I think it's one of the just heartbreaking moment is when Abby and Bill have that final talk together where he says, I didn't know what I had when I had you, and I should have never done anything, and it wasn't your fault, it was me, I did it all. And there's again, a worse film would have been, oh, so you like him now, do you? Oh, I see you in your fancy clothes, but there's a man who's just has no recriminations. And the tragic irony is that's exactly the point where he sees they've come to an understanding, they have a kiss, and it's a goodbye kiss, and the farmer sees it and thinks, oh, something is going on, and it isn't, it's just finished. So it's like, how tragic is that?
That's where you feel the kind of the movements of classic drama. Although they're very sort of subsumed into the beauty of the film, they are there.
That's classic
almost
irony.
Ideas, you're right, the ironic reversals and the classic, human touch of, you never know how much you love something until you lose it. And you are the one that's given her away. It's all your plan. And so that's it. Each character has their own tragedy, and that's, very Shakespearean.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has, there's no, there's that classical irony, but there's no winking irony. There's no postmodernism here. This is absolutely, this is what goes with myth, I think. And this is what some of our more recent filmmakers, don't want to do, and perhaps are even incapable of doing. And maybe as an audience, we don't want to see it. But then they're incapable of showing these kinds of passions seriously, And this is not a sentimental movie. This is not a movie.
Oh, no,
it's anti-sentiment. You get I guess we should talk a little bit as well about I said this film doesn't really have set pieces, but it does have one major set piece, which is the locusts, then the fire, and also
the biblical plagues that are brought upon them.
Within like a few minutes, we go from one biblical plague to another.
Yeah, and in terms of just Malick's gift for spectacle.
Yeah,
I think we often talk about him in terms of this kind of poetic way he shoots and edits and sort of interprets narrative, but he's capable of just breathtaking stuff. He's great just putting you in front of the camera and just showing you scale and action, if you want, in great kind of power. And I think it's in your book that you talk about what they did with the locusts. Was they sort of did it in reverse. They filmed things being dropped down, with sort of peanut shells, and great perfume being dropped down upon the field from helicopters, and then seemed to reverse the film, so it's locusts taking off.
Yeah,
You think, what a blindingly brilliant idea. Whoever came up with that, Jack Fisk probably, because he's the genius of that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But
it's taken from an old film. It's taken from an old 1940s film, that technique. But the thing that's funny is then in the background you have to have like cars driving backwards and somebody's dropped something, but it's actually on a string or something. So they have to do all these actions in reverse in the background to sell that it's not going backwards. There's a similar moment in Badlands where you have like three shots of three different animals, and it's like a hyena or a bird and an owl, or reptile and an owl, I think it is. And two of them were just like stuffed things that Jack Fisk had in his car, and he just put them out on a field and filmed them. And then the last one was an actual owl, and it just turns its head at the last moment. And if you didn't have that motion, you would start thinking, why is he filming these stuffed animals? But because that owl turns its head, it's like, oh yeah, they're all real animals, So there's that again, that illusion. But you're right, the locus is amazing, and it's built up like a Hitchcock. It's built up a little bit like The Birds, and with Linda Mann's discovering it. And you have this wonderful overhead shot as well, which again we don't quite. Those kinds of shots we don't tend to think of as Malick shots. We always think of sort of a much more eye level sort of handheld in more recent films. But it's a real director's shot. They've had to build a rig and put the camera there, and it's elaborate. And the same thing is true for The Fire. It's very elaborate, but the feeling you get from it is immersive. It's just like they've just set fire to a whole bunch of fields and thrown the camera crew and the actors in the middle of them and filmed until people were dead.
Do you get a sense with Days of Heaven? We were talking earlier about this kind of evolution of a style and Malick becoming Malick. Here is the point where, a little bit by necessity, that he's starting to shed the traditions. He's starting to go, I don't need to do, wide shot to mid shot to close up. I don't need to give you all the details. I don't need the dialogue. I don't need the exposition. I'm starting to realize what I can do without to get to the absolute root of what I want as a filmmaker.
Absolutely. I think that Almandaros was very important. Nestor was very important in this because he taught him things like the French reverse, which is this idea of if you film someone against a blank wall or against a sky, you can, instead of having to turn the camera crew round to film the reverse shot, you can just swap out the actors. And that's the French reverse shot. You don't, so you save a lot of time doing that, and especially when you've got a magic hour slot that you want to film in, you can do that without having to worry about a time of moving the camera. And so I think that they do that in very practical, technical ways. And Malick is excellent at this sort of technical stuff. His father was a photographer. And so I think he's second only to Kubrick in terms of his technical ability to use a camera and what a camera is possible. For instance, to get the magic hour, you have to be very aware of how much light a camera will receive before the film is unusable. And he would often push it much further than anybody else thought. And he would get this amazing photography. Usually confounding much more experienced sort of not necessarily cinematographers because of Nestor, but people who were who were sort of lighting it. He obviously, the gaffers hated him because he just didn't need lights. Didn't want lights, didn't want a generator on the. He wanted it to be completely free from that sort of paraphernalia. I mean, you can see in some of the what you call the montages, like there's a montage of the life that Bill and Abby, the farmer and Abby have together when Bill's gone away, and you can actually see them sort of playing baseball, and there's a outline of a boat they've made with rocks and things like that, and those were scenes, Those were full scenes with dialogue and all the rest of it. And he's just gone, well, we filmed them. I'm not going to have them as a scene, but I can use it as just as part of the montage. And that's enough. All you've got is time passed. They did this. and that's enough. I don't need anything else. I think as the interesting thing, what he does and what he learns in Days of Heaven, he will continuously refine all right through to the later films, Song to Song and Knight of Cups and To the Wonder, those last three films that he did, which many have considered to be of, let's say, debatable quality. I think he was still doing it. I think he was pushing the same thing he did in Days of Heaven to a further extreme in those three films, to the point that he lost his audience, to the point that the audience weren't able to keep up. And that's not to denigrate the audience. It's not, it's not the audience's responsibility necessarily. But I think he got unhooked from that. Yeah, he got so into experimenting with how little do I have to give someone before they actually, there's a whole story into The Wonder that is there, but you really have to watch it like 6 or 7 times to get the story.
So how did Days of Heaven do? How was it received at the time? Was it a success? I mean, again, we're talking about eras. It was launched into an era when this kind of film was much more readily, accessible to people, and they were expected. You were expected to go and watch difficult films. Not that I suggest this is difficult, but by modern terms, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think.
How did it do at the time?
It wasn't a huge. It made its money back. I mean, all of his films pretty much made their money back. Even sort of the flops that come later, he manages to work them out financially in such a way that they somehow make their money back by either selling international distribution or ancillary rights or whatever. There's a canniness to how he works, which is perhaps unsuspected by many people. The big jump here, I think, was he went from Badlands, got a very poor release initially, and so wasn't really seen by as many people as possible. And then his producers who really believed in him, Paul Williams and Ed Pressman, and they said, okay, let's do this. Let's a 4-wall theatre distribution. Let's hire cinemas out and show the film and just collect all the profits, and we'll build word of mouth in 5 or 6 cities, and we'll hit them with publicity. And so it ended up making a lot more money, and that sort of shamed Warner Brothers into having to release it more widely. When it came to Days of Heaven, not only did it sort of start earning more money back, but it also gave him Oscar nominations, which I think gives him much more visibility and an Oscar, and it won at Cannes. It won the jury prize at Cannes, which is huge for a second film by an American filmmaker. He was so I think he's absolutely, after this film, he's very much seen as and we talked about Charles Bloodhorn earlier. He loves him. I mean, he literally gives him a wing of the studio and says, "You should anything you want to do next." And he's all of Malick's staff are put on salary. He has Billy Weber is on salary now, and they have special effects people getting paid, and I mean, Charlie Bloodhorn says the fatal words of, "I don't care if you never make a dollar for me. I want to make movies with you," And I say again, don't say that, Charlie. It's not how this game works, man. I mean, even if that's what you want, don't say it, because that's the wrong thing to tell an artist. Tell the artist, give them constraints, and then they'll react better, I think. And then, of course, he... and I mean, like the music by Ennio Morricone, which, of course, there's some beautiful found music in here, but I think the winner of the music was Giorgio Moroder for Midnight Express.
It was Midnight Cowboy, wasn't it?
No, Midnight Express. Yeah, Alan Parker film. Yeah. And it's sort of like, yeah, why didn't you give Ennio Morricone the it's this music is now used in Cannes as the introduction to every film. So it's like it's almost the music that now means cinema. It's
Yeah. So it kind of, this is the great sort of Malick conundrum, certainly the first half of his career, is he reaches a point where he has established his career. He has done two excellent films. The critical community are coming round, but they're not quite there yet. There's a suspicion, there's something elusive there, but they're kind of working at it.
yeah.
He is successful. His films are, breaking even, beginning to make money. It's the point where, Spielberg's off doing Jaws, Scorsese's making Taxi Driver, The Godfather is filtering through the systems. All his peers or the next generation are breaking out and becoming very, very successful men. Yet Terrence Malick has a hiatus of 20 years. It's the kind of what happened. Why did you not seize that moment and keep going? And why did we have to wait so long for the Thin Red Line?
I mean, the first thing is the 20 years obviously aren't really 20 years because, he takes some time off. He's got a new girlfriend, Missy Gleason, who herself is a filmmaker. She's a documentary filmmaker, and she's making a film for Bert Schneider in Paris. So he goes over to spend time with her in Paris, and I'm not sure if he's involved with the film. It wouldn't surprise me if he was, but he's spending time, and I think he's enjoying Paris, and he speaks good French. He enjoys the city, and he's just kind of recovering. He has several projects that he's got lined up. Like any director, he'll have like 4 or 5 possible things moving, and which one gets the green light, who knows. One is The Elephant Man, which has nothing to do with what will become David Lynch's Elephant Man, but he goes quite far on the idea of doing like a road show of the Elephant Man and making it into some sort of that horrible idea that lots of directors had in the 60s of making some sort of event rather than just a movie.
Yeah.
And when he hears that Lynch is doing his film, it's like, okay, well, that's that out the window. But he did a lot of research on that, and he was, the guys from Pink Floyd were going to do the light show and that sort of stuff. And he had another couple of ideas that were sort of boiling away. These were with the producers who would later on come back into the picture with the Thin Red Line. The White Hotel came up at some point. But under all this was this idea of this film that has been called Q. Now, this title has been somewhat disputed because he'd always use a letter for as a sort of code name for projects anyway. Especially later on, there's, I think To the Wonder was called K for a long time. But it was essentially a version of the Tree of Life, which would involve a sort of mythic beginning of a universe, the Big Bang, the creation of life on our planet, and then it would go into some sort of story, and then it would go to the end of the universe. That was that sort of basic structure which we see in the Tree of Life was down. And he had like the guy who just finished Star Trek the Motion Picture, Richard Wilson, was a big special effects guy. He had him on the payroll. He said it was the biggest disappointment of his life when that film didn't take off because it was such a fascinating idea. He sent off people around the world to film. And now he had the budget for it. Instead of sending someone to Wisconsin or to Missouri to do these shots, he could say, right, I want Barrier Reef. I want this particular fish. I want this volcanic eruption in Etna. And he'd send these guys off and they'd come back with this amazing footage. And all he had to do was come up with a story that would tie it all together and create this thing. And basically to cut a long story short, he never came up with that story. It was going to be set in the First World War and have something to do with his grandparents. It was going to have something to do with the massacre that was the original reason for the diaspora, for the people from Persia, where his family originally originated from. There was talk of it being about his great grandparents, who was a guy who was a sort of liberation leader and a bandit. And he just couldn't quite get onto a story that was interesting enough for him or practical, and that tied into this fascination he had with origins and with the start of all things, of all life, and that ambitious, 2001: A Space Odyssey style of thing that he was thinking of. And so the next 20 years was spent script doctoring and walking around Europe and reading a lot and spending a lot of time doing ornithology and falling in and out of love, getting married, having a family. Some people say he became a hairdresser in this time, but I've not
I
not
do
been
remember
able
when I was in Empire that story, because at that point we weren't even positive what he looked like anymore.
Yeah.
And so there was this kind of like, we were going to do this whole story about, have you seen Terrence Malick? Have you had your hair cut by him? And then Neon existed at the time, and they were going to do a cover which was just a kind of like a bit of sort of foil mirroring with the headline, "Are you Terrence Malick?" That was the kind of ongoing joke, just as the Thin Red Line finally arrived and he re-emerged. But
I mean, there were all these. I mean, the Thin Red Line then took like 2 or 3 years to go from from the book and the script to the finished product. But I mean, you look at, say, the gap between Star Wars and The Phantom Menace, and the idea of somebody sort of disappearing and then coming back again. It doesn't feel that as long as it did. It feels much longer now. It felt longer then. I think because of the idea that I first encountered Terrence Malick going to see, watching Moviedrome, the Alex Cox series, and they did Badlands, and I think Days of Heaven turned up in sort of Channel 4 series that was just about cinematography. And when Alex Cox did his introduction about Badlands, he basically said, no one knows who this guy is. No one knows what he's done. Maybe he's dead on drugs. Maybe maybe he just hates Hollywood. And if he does, good luck to him. I totally understand it. But there was no sense that he was coming back, or he was, he'd gone, and that was it. He'd created 2 amazing films, and he was out of it. So I think that was the main thing. It wasn't like nowadays Steven Soderbergh, retires on Monday and is back with 3 films on Friday. I don't believe it for a second. I don't believe Tarantino will finish at his 10th film either. I just don't. I don't think they have the willpower. But Malick's willpower was not only disappearing for 20 years when he didn't want to do anything, because there was plenty of people, including Mike Medavoy, his old agent, who had studios under his. Just think about this. Terrence Malick hasn't given an interview since 1978. How many people in this industry at that level getting money for making films can just say, I'm not giving any more interviews, that's that, and get away with it? I mean, I can't think of anybody else.
Yeah. To that level. Yeah.
Can you imagine not George Lucas, well, even George Lucas, but even George Clooney, or someone who's massively famous, doesn't have to do social media, can limit his interviews, but the idea that he would just say, I'm not doing any interviews for Wolves, Yeah.
I mean, your film will disappear. Even Spielberg now, he will, he's not a guaranteed hit. He will have to, on whatever level he controls, promote his films. He will have to do television appearances. He will have to do the making ofs, and he will have to do probably New York Times and the big sort of media outlets. But to not do anything and to make it a policy of, this is what I'm not as a filmmaker and artist. I'm not going to go on the record on any, not just in terms of promotion, but in terms of finding. In terms of relaying your legacy to people, he's unwilling to do that, in the sense that I think Scorsese is very conscious of, that he wants to have it down on the record, and Tarantino's like that. I'm going to tell my own story, whereas Malick is just happy to let people like you and me kind of feed off him and try and interpret him, and to try and get there, because he creates this wonderful vacuum that your book, thankfully, is helping to fill. Just bring it to a conclusion. Let's bring it to a conclusion. Where do you think? Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I'm just taking my camera off.
Okay. Just where do you think Days of Heaven stands in terms of the Malick canon? If I came to you and said I've never watched a Malick film, I'm interested in Days of Heaven, would you say this was the film you have to start with? Where does it stand?
That's tough. I mean, I think you can go chronologically with Malick, and you're pretty much every film is great and you see the development. I think Badlands is one of the best debuts ever, and it could be his best movie. Days of Heaven is one of the best second movies ever and could be his best movie, and so on and so forth. It's almost like if you were to say, I'm only going to watch one Badlands movie. I'm only going to watch one Malick movie ever. Days of Heaven might be the one I would point you towards, because I think it's just purely Malick.
Yeah.
It couldn't have been made by anybody else. Thin Red Line is in conversation with other war movies, even as it's a very Malick war movie. Badlands is in conversation with many road movies and Lovers on the Run movie, even though it's, again, very unique and very distinct. But I think Days of Heaven, I mean, you talked about Westerns earlier, and we talked about, but it doesn't really feel like it's in conversation. It is. It touches on all that, and it is influenced by those things to some degree, but you feel it exists on its own as a sort of unique artifact. It's like the wine glass that's dropped in the river.
Yeah.
It's still there. It's still being twirled by the currents, and for that reason it's really, it's the one to that's got the epitome of what it means to be Terrence Malick.
They are. It's a brilliant way to finish, I think.
Thank you.